Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary, and if you were wondering why the thumbnail was censored, I think it should be pretty obvious now why I had to do that, because we're going to be dealing once again in this issue with some pretty heavy subject matter, and, well, what can I say? That's just Spawn number 30, so let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in April of 1995, it's a doozy of a cover, folks, and, obviously there are people who are going to be offended by this cover, which is completely understandable. It's very graphic, very emotion-inducing, and despite all that, it actually does a pretty phenomenal job of setting the tone for what the story of this book is on the interior. So I have to credit Greg Capullo in that fashion in terms of, he and Todd are getting the message across on what to expect once you get into this book, and you're going to see what I'm talking about once we get inside. Story, Todd McFarlane. Art, Greg Capullo, Todd McFarlane, and a special thanks to Kevin Conrad. Copy editor and letters, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Steve Oliff and Ollie Optics. We can see here on the first page Spawn in an empty field walking at night. He's actually been walking from the small town that we saw him in Alabama to New York City, as he doesn't want to waste any of his power to teleport, which is a wise decision given that his power level, as we can see, has now dropped below 7,000, meaning he's used up quite a bit of it in a rather short period of time, relatively speaking. He states that, in his thoughts, I should say, he's not talking to himself, that he can feel the devil watching him and tormenting him. Obviously, he's speaking about Mabalja, whose likeness is in the clouds above him. That's a really cool artistic touch. And he's also kind of losing himself in depressive thoughts. He believed that he was helping the two boys in issue 29, Eddie and Andy. However, as we saw at the end of that book, it wasn't the type of help that they needed, and things did not turn out at all the way that Spawn thought they would for the two boys. And he's also having contradictory thoughts about things that were going on with Wanda and also Angela as well, as we're going to see going forward. As Spawn wanders through the wilderness, he starts to express the fact that he's actually kind of angry at Wanda for being afraid of him when he saved her from the men who attacked her in the alleyways back in New York City. But he's kind of glossing over the fact that this woman who had never experienced violence in that manner watched him just completely rip three dudes apart, and mercilessly so. So it's understandable that that would be her reaction, but again, he's kind of falling into this trap of believing that, Wanda should be wanting to have him back in her life the way that he wants to be back in her life. However, he's completely neglecting to acknowledge the fact that he died and that Wanda has moved on with her life, and while she may still miss her former husband, she's under the illusion that she's never going to see him again, and she has no idea that Spawn is in fact the man that she lost. So it's a very odd way for him to be blaming her for something that she hasn't done wrong. He also starts to put blame on Angela, believing that she took advantage of him when they slept together in the third issue of the Angela miniseries. Now, that being said, if you haven't watched my videos on the Angela miniseries, I suggest you do so, because that's the entire explanation as to why Spawn is not in New York City currently to begin with. He then has his attention distracted from his own thoughts, which is probably for the best at this point, when he sees two trucks driving down the road, and we can see here that those two trucks are filled with Klansmen carrying torches, despite the fact that no torch would actually be able to stay lit as you're holding it out the window of a speeding truck. And as it zooms by, Spawn actually tries to talk himself out of what he just saw, believing that this type of thing doesn't happen anymore and that these people aren't out there. He then goes back into his thoughts, believing that It's just some rowdy guys who are going to a party somewhere and are going to be burning the midnight oil. And he then starts to ask himself if, the thoughts and memories that he has about Wanda are, her feelings, the way she actually is, observing and taking in and experiencing the world as it's actually happening, or if these things are the way that Spawn wants her to feel, like if he's actually projecting his own desires onto her, which, by the way, he absolutely is. He then hears that, or notices that there's a large bit of light coming from up ahead and believes that that's the party that the men were headed to. And he decides he's going to distract himself by just kind of lingering in the shadows and observing people having a good time. However, when he gets close, he hears a woman screaming and someone yelling, "Stop it," and sees that, there's actually something far more nefarious at play than just a rowdy party. As Spawn gets closer, he comes upon the home and farm of the Armstrong family, who are the people that are the target of the Klansmen's terrorizing acts of setting their cornfields on fire. Brad Armstrong, the head of the family and owner of the property, is doing his best to try and protect his home and family as he grabs a garden hose and tries to spray down a fire line to keep the fire from getting to his house. His wife is pleading with him desperately, terrified that they're all going to die, believing that everything is lost and that they should be running instead, and that it's a futile effort to try and fight back against these men who are terrorizing them and threatening them with violence. And she's also terrified for the life of their son, who we see holding his father's shotgun as his father fights desperately to keep the flames from the home. However, Brad turns around and screams at his wife, stating that he's not going to give up and he's not going to let these men intimidate him, that this is his land, it was his family's land, and he's going to stay here and protect it. If he has to die in the process, then so be it, but he's not going to give up without a fight. However, this is not what his wife wants to hear, as she believes that he's become completely obsessed with this. And, she's trying to reason with him, saying that, their lives are more important than any land. And while she, is definitely sympathetic to his opinions on the matter, she's more concerned about the safety of them and their son, who we see back on the porch turns and happens to notice Spawn creeping up through the cornfield. At this point, we see Brad run back to the house, grab the shotgun from his son, and demand to know who's in the bushes. As Spawn steps forward, they're obviously intimidated by it, as Spawn says, it looks like you could use some help. And assumedly, he, I guess, puts out the flames, because at this point, they don't seem to be a threat at any moment going forward. So that's the only assumption I can make, because this garden hose was clearly not doing the job, and the fire is never brought up again. So I guess Spawn was the one who took care of it. Brad points his shotgun at Spawn and, tells him to stay where he's at. Spawn says he's unarmed and holds out his hands, but Brad, understandably, given the circumstances, is not willing to just let that be the moment when his guard goes down, as he puts the shotgun barrel directly in Spawn's forehead and says, you go back and tell those clan buddies of yours that, you're not going to be the one who forces us off our land. Spawn states that he's not a member of the clan and he's not friends with them, but Brad is like, well, then how come you're hiding your face? Why are you wearing a mask? What are you hiding it from? And Spawn just simply states, my past. Also, I'm not certain if his name is Brad Armstrong after the professional wrestler. For those of you who don't know, Brad Armstrong was a pro wrestler who had limited success in the early and mid-90s in WCW. He's the son of Bullet Bob Armstrong, who you may or may not know, depending on how much you know about wrestling, and the older brother of one Brian Gerard James, who most of you probably would know better as the Road Dogg in WWE. And I kind of have to wonder, did Todd just pull that name out of a hat, or was he actually just like a really big time WCW fan and was like, I'm going to name this guy after a pro wrestler? Spawn then begins to explain to the Armstrongs that he is well aware of what it's like to be held down by the white man, as he tells them about his past in working with the government and how he always felt as if he was just another black face that they hired as a means to fill a quota. He also felt the same way about his friend Terry Fitzgerald, and that whenever any mistakes were made, those mistakes always seemed to fall at the feet of him and the other men of color who worked for the government, and that, they were always told to just be patient and that things would work out, and that, when you start to ask too many questions or start to stand up for yourself, then they just get someone else who's more cooperative to fill your place, and in this case, we see an image of Chapel. And then that person takes your role and you're always held down. And he then takes off his mask to show them that while their fields have burned, his face was burned and he's been through a lot of suffering on his own. Now, one of the problems that kind of exists a little bit with this story point is that up until now, we've never been given any type of information that suggested that Spawn was facing off against a lot of racism during his time as Al Simmons working for the government. That's not to say that he didn't or that he couldn't have. It was just never presented that way. It was always presented that Jason Wynn was using his position in the government to take out people for his own financial gain and his own increasing levels of power, and that Wynn, who is just an all-around evil man, had Al Simmons murdered because Al was starting to put the pieces together that Wynn was definitely not following protocol and was breaking all kinds of treaties and human rights violations and that sort of thing, and that he was going to blow the whistle, so Wynn had him murdered to keep him quiet and make sure that he could remain in power. And while it's entirely possible that Jason Wynn may in fact be very racist, at this point in the story, that's never been brought up or shown to be one of Wynn's character traits. So it is kind of odd to have all of this just kind of shotgunned at us in one page. At this point, after removing the mask, Brad's wife says, honey, put the gun away. Can't you see this man suffered? But Brad states, he hasn't suffered anything like we have. We're sitting here dealing with all these Klan members every day, trying to run us off our land, terrorizing our family, making us live in this nightmare while our son has to see us suffer. And he's going to do everything he can to try and fight back, even if he has to go to the courts. However, Spawn then replies stating, listen, there's no law in this town that's going to stop those men, and those men don't care about the law in the first place. You're better off listening to your wife because no good is going to come of this situation, as he leaves. The next night, we see the Klansmen are burning a cross in a field because of course they are. What else would they be doing? And going on about racist rhetoric and stating that they're going to do what it takes to run the Armstrong family off their land and perhaps use a little bit of cleansing fire to do so. What they don't realize is that Spawn is lurking in the shadows, watching this all happen, and coming up with a plan and way that he can protect the Armstrongs from these evil men. As the men all gather into their trucks to leave, Spawn is down the road creating a pipe bomb that he's laying across the road and then filling up with gasoline. And as the trucks approach, Spawn throws a match into the pipe, causing it to explode. There's just one problem. That's not at all how this would work. Gasoline in its liquid state is not explosive. It's only explosive in its gaseous state. So when he throws the match down the open end of the pipe, all it would do would be to cause the exposed bit of gasoline that's in this part of the pipe to burst into flames and just start burning up through the top of this pipe. It wouldn't cause this kind of an explosion. So that's kind of a plot hole, but I'm assuming Todd probably didn't know that, and most people just assume that gasoline in its liquid state is explosive. And in this case, for the story, it was, which caused the 2 truckloads of Klansmen to wreck in spectacular fashion. And as the men are all trying to get to their feet and figure out what happened, Spawn steps out in front of them and shouts, "Leave the Armstrong Ranch alone." And the Klansmen respond by then shooting Spawn right between the eyes and blasting a bullet through the back of his head. This knocks Spawn out cold as he falls to the ground, and the men wonder exactly what happened and who this was. The leader wants to know who this man was, and as the Klansmen try to pick him up, they realize, wow, this guy is super heavy, and we can't move him. They then try to remove his mask, however, it won't come off as his costume is still actively trying to do its best to protect him, but we do realize how much of a weakened state it is, or it's in right now after his fight that took place in heaven, because we've seen his costume stop bullets with absolutely no problem in the past, and in this case, it couldn't muster up enough strength to do so, which allowed him to get shot through the head. The leader of the Klansmen in this group then states, listen, I don't care who he is, that's not important right now. Just get the chain and we're gonna finish this guy off in the way that we always do, which I think at this point you can all guess what that means. The men then remove a chain from their pickup and use it to hang Spawn from a tree. And as they're driving off, the leader tells two of the men to come back the next day and pull him down so that there's no evidence left for anyone to discover. Which begs the question, if you don't want anyone to see this, why the hell would you do it in the first place? That doesn't make any sense from a perspective of the plot. Now, I understand that this is powerful imagery and they're trying to convey the idea of the scourge of the Klan and the evils that they're willing to do. And this definitely, does that with this type of an image. But again, in terms of the idea that they don't want anyone to ever see this, that doesn't make any sense with the way that the plot's written. Meanwhile, back in New York City, we see that Sam and Twitch are in the middle of a firefight with a perp. And this would kind of be okay to do this little segue back to New York to let us know what's going on with some of the other characters, were it not for the fact that the men are literally just going over the fact that they discovered in the files that Spawn gave them that the police chief was the one who hired Billy Kincaid to murder all those children. And we already knew that. We read about all of that in issue number 27 of Spawn. So I'm not certain why it's being reiterated as we see the men continue to chase down the perp that they're trying to catch. And as he hops over a fence, Sam realizes, hey, I'm not making it over this fence quick enough, and asks if Twitch can take care of this guy for them. Twitch then takes aim with his semi-automatic pistol, unlike the revolver that he's been depicted with previously. This is probably just Greg taking over and drawing Twitch with just the gun that he thought he should have versus the gun that he had been using up until this point, and Todd not really giving him any kind of direction about making sure to keep Twitch with the revolver, even though the revolver technically makes a little bit more sense with the whole sharpshooter aspect of Twitch's character. He unleashes one round, which shoots through a cable that's holding up the fire escape. We see the man trying to use to get away in the reflection of Twitch's glasses here. Very cool imagery, actually, right there. The fire escape then drops and plows the man back first into the cement and then holds him down so that he can't get away. Sam then says, hey, great shot, buddy. You're pretty good for a pencil-necked geek. And Twitch says, I'll take that as a compliment. Back in wherever the heck Spawn is at, because it's never really explained. It did say in the beginning of the book that he had been walking for like 1,000 miles at this point, after he left Alabama, and that it's been about a month since issue number 29. But it doesn't say exactly what part of the country he's in. And at this point, we see Armstrong finding Spawn hung from the tree and believing that Spawn has been murdered by the Klan. Of course, Brad nor the Klansmen know that Spawn, in fact, is already dead and that they definitely did not kill him. Armstrong states he's going to take care of those murderous bastards. And unfortunately, those murderous bastards now have the drop on him, as the two men that were instructed to come and hide the body have returned and got the jump on Brad Armstrong. They then kick him into the ground and start stomping him out, telling him that, he needs to give up and leave his land and let them take over his farm. And as they believe they have won the day and standing over Brad Armstrong, knowing that he can't fight back against them, one of the men tells the other to grab the body down from the tree when he suddenly realizes that his friend is no longer there. He turns around again to see Spawn is definitely not dead, as he realizes that whatever's about to happen is not going to be good for him, as we see a flash, and we then never see these guys again in the rest of this issue, as the two of them are laid out next to Mr. Armstrong, and we see the empty noose. We then are teleported to a courtroom where Mr. Armstrong has brought a lawsuit against the Klansmen who are terrorizing him. Now, this lawyer who is representing the Klansmen is almost certainly one of them, and is making the argument that Mr. Armstrong has presented no real evidence to back up any of the claims that he's made, and that, he's basically come into the courtroom and accused these men of committing a murder, but he has no evidence to support that this murder ever happened. And he then asks the judge if there's anything else he needs to say before, the judge rules on whether or not he's going to hear this case. And Armstrong is definitely very angry in the background as his lawyer tries to calm him down, but he's not too optimistic about the outlook of his case going forward. We then see Armstrong stand up, and he simply states that this whole thing is a sham. His lawyer tries to apologize, stating that, Mr. Armstrong is just a little angry. Please excuse my client, Judge Misson. However, the judge basically just is pretty hot about the whole thing and states, the next time you want to waste this court's time with defaming lawsuits, you should probably have some evidence, and if you're going to accuse someone of murder, you should probably have a body that can prove that that ever happened. He then tells Armstrong to get out of his courtroom before he holds him in contempt, and Armstrong just states, this whole thing just makes him sick. We then are shown that the judge himself is actually the leader of the Klan, and he's yelling at everyone in a barn, stating, this is it, we're going to finally get the Armstrongs off of their land. This Thursday night, we're going to go over there and we're going to do whatever it takes to get their land from them and send them packing, as all the men are, rallied up into a fever pitch as they're all ready to go and carry out their evil plot. Now, the whole point of this was to show that the judge is in fact a racist and very corrupt, which is fine. The only problem is that even if he were not, there is literally no judge who would have let this this case proceed, given the total lack of evidence that Armstrong had in this case. He's exactly right. You can't just be like, someone got murdered, but nobody knows who they are, and there's no body to show for it. Because keep in mind, the only people that knew Spawn was even in this town were the Klansmen themselves and Armstrong. No one else had had any interaction with him. So to prove that he died and was murdered by these men would have been completely impossible. What would have made more sense was for Armstrong to have shown up, and I mean this in the sense of writing, like from a story standpoint, was for Armstrong to show up with a bunch of evidence stating that the Klan had been harassing him and his family and threatening them with violence and destroying his property, and the judge then declaring, oh, well, that's all circumstantial and we can't admit that into the evidence, and you have no way to present your case now, blah, blah, blah. And that would have been a much better illustration of his corruption and hatred for Armstrong, and would have made a lot more sense in the context of the story, rather than this whole thing with the murder that doesn't make any sense from Armstrong's standpoint. It's just kind of like sloppy writing. We then see that several of the Klansmen are all just going about their lives as they get ready to raid the Armstrong home Thursday night. One of them is creating moonshine with a still. However, Spawn has paid him a visit and spiked his still with gasoline as we see him spitting it out. Another man is said in this text box to be polishing his Webley Fosbury 455 automatic revolver. Unfortunately, there was probably some kind of communication breakdown between Todd and Greg, because Greg did not draw this man holding a revolver. He drew this man holding a shotgun. Huge mistake in the continuity and story of this issue, because it's not even remotely the same gun. Like, you'd think that the two of them would have been a little bit more on the same page to make sure that these kind of mistakes didn't happen. He is said to be polishing his quote-unquote revolver because of how much he loves it and how much he spent to buy it. And when he falls asleep with it, he then wakes up to find the barrel of his revolver, which is actually a shotgun, twisted up into a corkscrew as Spawn decided to destroy his most prized possession. We then see a third Klansman who spent 2 years saving up for a down payment on this beautiful pickup truck that's supposedly the most powerful 4x4 on the market. And as he tries to drive it away, he fails to realize that Spawn had chained the rear axle of the truck to a tree, which rips the axle clean off the back end of the truck, destroying it. And finally, Spawn decides to pay the judge himself a visit in his own chambers as he jumps down from the ceiling and tells the judge that he's had enough of all of the judge's antics, and he wants to have a face-to-face with him at the Armstrong Ranch just before midnight on Thursday. However, the judge, feeling that he has been slighted and also believing that Spawn is not the same man that he thought he had killed before, but he believes that this is actually Armstrong wearing the costume of that man, calls up the rest of the clan and tells them that he wants to have a 10-minute head start and wants to go in alone at first so that he can deal with Armstrong face-to-face before the rest of the men show up. Going into Thursday night, he kicks the door down to the ranch and demands that Armstrong show himself and that he give up and get out of town. Suddenly, a plate crashes behind him and he turns around and opens fire with an Uzi, unleashing a hailstorm of bullets. However, in this moment of distraction, he doesn't realize that Spawn is right behind him and now has the jump on him. As Spawn grabs the judge in a chokehold and rips the gun out of his hands, he lets the judge know that he is definitely not Armstrong and that he is indeed the man that the judge thought he had killed. He then grabs the noose from the judge and throws it around his neck, and he states that, there's nothing he can say that's going to get through the judge's racist brain and change his mind about anything. But the only thing that the one judge will listen to is one thing in particular, and that's fear, as he pins him to the ground with the noose around his neck and states that he's going to make sure that the judge feels the same kind of fear that he's been inflicting upon so many innocent victims, most notably the Armstrongs included, along with all of the other people that the judge and the Klansmen ran out of town. I also like that Greg drew this picture right here with the cape remnants coming down and pinning the judge's gun to the ground so that he can't grab it and use it against Spawn. I thought that was a really cool little detail that he put in there. He then rips the judge's hood off and states, none of this bothers you. I know that, you think that everything's going to be just fine and that you're going to get out of this, but I got something that I'm going to do to you that you really might hate. Suddenly, they see the headlights of the trucks coming up towards the house, and Spawn looks up and says, "Oh, I guess your friends are here." And at this point, the judge thinks that he now has the upper hand and states, "Oh, yeah, that's right, they are, you fool, and you're about to die. They're definitely going to kill you, and there's nothing you can do about it." Completely overlooking the fact that he's already seen Spawn get shot through the eyes and, he should be dead, but he's very much alive and is now on top of the judge threatening him. However, Spawn knows that this was what was going to happen, as he's been eavesdropping on all of the plans that the judge has been making the entire time. And he says, "You know what? Let's just see how well your friends actually know you." And as the truck drives up to the house, we see a bunch of flashing green lights. However, the Klansmen don't notice them as they jump out of the truck and are barking orders at each other and trying to get in position and make their way towards the door of the house, expecting to potentially deal with the Armstrongs and having a firefight on their hands. They're very much amped up and ready to go, but they come across something that they weren't expecting once they go inside. The Klansmen then burst through the door. However, Spawn is now long gone and has disappeared like a ghost. They then see the judge lying on the ground in his robes and are distraught, believing that he's harmed in some way. And when they turn him over, they see instead a black man wearing the robes. However, this is in fact the judge, and Spawn decided to change the color of his skin and his appearance so that he would now have to face the racism and hatred that he tried to propagate. The men believe that this is just some random black man who stole the robes from the judge and is now, quote unquote, desecrating them by wearing their, sacred robes. So they decide that they're going to institute their brand of justice against the man. However, the judge, not realizing that his appearance has been changed, tries to plead with them, stating, what are you guys doing, as he starts to call out their names. However, they completely ignore this and at one point eventually just pistol whip him to shut him up and knock him out, as they pull him out of the house and take him to a familiar field. Meanwhile, in another part of the county, Spawn meets back up with Armstrong and hands him a file that he stole from the judge's office and tells him that this file holds all the information about how the judge and the rest of the Klan were terrorizing the town and, instituting all this violence and racism towards the members of the town who were African American. And he then tells Armstrong that he's going to have to take this to some sort of law enforcement outside of this county to make sure that justice is served, and that anyone who gets their hands on this that's a legitimate prosecutor will have no trouble making the case of, all of the illegal stuff that the Klan and the judge were doing. And they should even be able to get all of the land that they took from the other people that they ran out of town returned to them. Armstrong is kind of shocked about all of this and just thanks Spawn for what he did, and is just like, it's kind of surprising. I really believe that, God moves in some mysterious ways. He then states, I really do, though, hope that the judge doesn't cause any more problems. And Spawn states not to worry. He doesn't think that the judge is going to be a problem ever again. Now, the one problem I have with all of this is that earlier in the book, Spawn kind of went on a tangent talking about how black people can't trust the government because the white man is trying to hold them down. And now he's telling this black man, Mr. Armstrong, to trust the government in another county, even though the government of this county has been treating him like garbage and stripping him of his rights and been absolutely terrible to him. It's very conflicting the way that this story is written. And again, I realize there are in fact good people in government and there are bad people in government, and there are racist people in government and there are non-racist people in government. This is a reality of our world, especially back in the 90s when this comic was printed. But it does seem odd that Spawn would have such a long-winded speech about how, he was held down and how the government actively tried to, suppress his goals and life because of his skin color, and then handing another man of the same skin color this file and telling him, no worries, man, the government's going to have your back on this one. It's just an odd way to finish up the story. And on the final page of the story, we see all of the Klansmen going back to their trucks as we see the judge's feet dangling in the air, as this is most likely the same tree that we saw Spawn hanging from earlier in the book. We then get to image info. Once again, nothing special to see here. We've seen it dozens of times before, and this is just a little blurb about upcoming comic books in the image lineup. We then reach the spawning ground, the letter section of the book, where most of the letters this time around are people complaining about how resellers are going to big box retailers and buying up all of the Todd Toys Spawn figures and then taking them to their own comic book stores or collectible stores and marking them up and reselling them. And, it's a valid complaint. I understand people being angry about that. However, none of them seem to realize that Todd has absolutely no control over that sort of thing and can't actually do anything about it, which he explains to them in basically every response. He's like, look, man, I get where you're coming from. That does suck. However, there's literally nothing I can do to stop Walmart from selling the toys to some guy that owns a comic book store nearby, or Target, or whoever gets these things. And I think this is probably just more a case of the time period and people not realizing that, the manufacturer can't really do a whole lot in terms of stopping these kinds of practices. But then again, in the mid 90s, they didn't have the same kind of access to information that we do in the present day. And, it's believable that they would possibly think that somehow Todd could, detour these practices or stop them from happening altogether. There is one letter, however, that I found a little bit more thought-provoking, as one guy wrote in stating how angry he was at Todd for seeming somewhat hypocritical. And his argument was that, Todd and the other guys who founded Image left Marvel because they felt like they were being mistreated and undervalued and underpaid to make effectively millions upon millions of dollars for this big giant mega company. And that Todd was now doing the exact same thing to the Asian workers in China who were producing his toys, which is a valid critique. And Todd doesn't really address it. He more or less kind of sidesteps it and just states, man, if that's all you can take away from what I've done and my experiences, then you probably just shouldn't be reading my book anymore at all. And I really hope that going forward, you have like a better outlook on life or something to that effect. But the guy's making a valid critique. Todd is essentially exploiting these poor people in another country on the other side of the world to produce his toys at a lower cost so that he can keep his costs down. Now, Todd also is a victim of circumstance in the sense that because of the way the system is that he had to operate within, he couldn't produce those toys inside of America and be able to sell them at a reasonable price that would actually give him the ability to have a successful business. So, I understand why he was doing it, but he didn't go to the trouble of trying to explain that either. He just kind of was like, hey man, you can think that way, but you're wrong because I said so. Which seems like kind of a weird way to address that letter. I really kind of wish he had done a little bit better job of trying to explain that, he may not like that circumstance, but it's the circumstance that he had to operate within if he was going to ever make a toy company in the first place. We then get this really cool 2-page splash that was done by one Greg F. Weish. And we can see here it is Spawn engaging in battle with Angela. This actually looks really cool. I am kind of surprised at how big Angela was drawn here, though. She's like, essentially, she looks like she's actually even bigger than Spawn. And I don't know if this was just like kind of a mistake on the artist's part, or maybe he got the perspective a little bit wrong, because the two of them are actually on the same plane in this image. In fact, you could actually make the argument that Spawn's slightly closer to us than Angela is, so she should be drawn a little smaller. But overall, the detail seems cool, and I really like the action pose that he has the two of them in. It's not bad. I just think it's a little weird that he made Angela so big. We then get 2 pages of Image fan art. I always like to see these. Super cool that you could send in your artwork and get it published in a national comic book. All of the ones this month are just Spawn and Angela, or Spawn and Angela together. Todd probably was putting these out as, again, issue number 29 and issue number 30 are direct follow-ups to the Angela miniseries. The Angela miniseries, of course, being like a super hot property at this point, making the character of Angela even more popular. So he's probably just trying to ride that wave and publish the artwork sent in of her, along with all of the artwork being sent in of Spawn. We then see an advertisement for the next wave of Todd toys. We've seen this in some other books, the new figures being displayed prominently, coming in spring of '95. And we then get an advertisement for the Max animated series airing on MTV. If you've never had a chance to watch this, I suggest you do. It's actually a really cool cartoon. And while it has a lot of similarities to the comic book, it doesn't end on the same note that the comic book does. It's a very different ending entirely. Also, this cartoon was actually a little bit ahead of its time in the way that it used computer-generated imagery to change perspectives and create backgrounds. It was really unique, and it was a really cool way to do things, especially back in the mid-90s. This cartoon was a little bit ahead of its time on a technical aspect. We then get an advertisement for the Spawn trading cards. As I've stated in prior issues where we've seen this, or episodes I should say, where we've seen this advertisement, I don't care for these trading cards. I have a bunch of them. They're a weird size that you can't find sleeves for, and honestly, the artwork on many of them is not all that great. I bought them because I like Spawn, but realistically, if I never had them, I probably would have been just fine because I don't care that much for them. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for the Violator vs. Badrock miniseries. And I will be making videos on the entirety of that miniseries because I have the entirety of that miniseries. So stay tuned and keep your eyes out for that in the future. And that was Spawn number 30. And honestly, this isn't really an issue of the book that I like all that much. I just feel as though while Todd ultimately got the story to where he wanted it to go, he didn't do it in the best way possible. And what I mean by that is when you're taking a group of people like the Klan as your antagonists, and this is a group of real world people who are propagating overt racism and white supremacy and a bunch of really bad ideas and doing a bunch of really evil, hateful things to people of color, and for no other reason than just to propagate a message of hate. You do a disservice to the reader in presenting them in anything more than the most realistic means possible. Because if at any point you start to portray them in more of a cartoonish boogeyman type of light, it starts to diminish how bad their actions are in real life. And you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you're presenting to the reader the most accurate representation of how bad these people are and how bad their ideas are, to make sure that you are conveying to anyone who reads this book, do not be these people. Do not go down that path. Do not help them propagate their message. That needs to be the focus. And again, ultimately, I think that's where Todd got to. He did do the job of making sure to portray everything that they were doing as wrong and evil. But I feel like he kind of made them a little bit too over the top in some parts, which to me sort of distracts a little from the reality of the problems that a group like the Klan causes for a lot of real world victims. But then again, these are just my opinions. You might have the opinion that Todd totally nailed it and that he shouldn't have done anything different. And if that's your opinion, I understand, and it's fine because everyone's entitled to their own opinion. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.